Welcome to History in Audio. I'm Hugo.
And I'm Paul. Today, we're talking about one of the most famous battles in all of human history, a 3-day rearguard action in a narrow mountain pass that has never stopped reverberating through Western culture. We're talking about the Battle of Thermopylae, 480 BC.
The 300 Spartans. Even people who know nothing about ancient history know that story.
And almost everything they know is wrong, which is exactly why we're here. The real story is more complicated, more heroic, and in some ways far more remarkable than the film version.
Let's start with the big picture.
What was actually at stake in 480 BC? Everything, really. The ancient Persian Empire under King Xerxes I was the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Egypt to the borders of India. And Xerxes had a personal reason to invade Greece. His father, Darius, had sent a force to punish Athens 10 years earlier, in 490 BC, after Athens had supported a revolt against Persian rule. That expedition ended in humiliation at the Battle of Marathon, where a heavily outnumbered Athenian army routed the Persians. Xerxes spent the next decade preparing a response that would leave absolutely nothing to chance. How big are we talking? Ancient sources give figures in the millions, which modern historians dismiss as propaganda. The scholarly consensus puts the Persian army somewhere between 120,000 and 300,000 men, still an almost incomprehensible force for the ancient world. Herodotus writes that when this army reached one river, the soldiers drank it dry. Even allowing for exaggeration, this was a force that had no precedent in Greek experience.
And the Greeks' response was to stand in a mountain pass with 7,000 men?
That's the genius of it. The Athenian statesman Themistocles came up with a dual strategy: block the Persian army at the narrow pass of Thermopylae while simultaneously holding the Persian navy at the Straits of Artemisium. Thermopylae, which means hot gates, named for the sulfur springs there, was around 100 meters wide as a pass, and the hot springs had been channeled to create a marsh, and the only usable fighting surface was a causeway across that marsh barely wide enough for a single chariot. A vast army becomes useless when it can only advance in single file.
So it wasn't suicidal, it was actually smart.
It was strategically sound. And here's the first myth to bust. People say 300 Spartans held off 1,000,000 Persians. The actual Greek force at Thermopylae numbered around 7,000 men. Spartans, yes, but also soldiers from Thespiae, Corinth, Arcadia, Thebes, Phocis, and others. The 300 Spartans were part of that force, not the whole of it.
So why did only 300 Spartans show up? Sparta had a fearsome military. Couldn't they send more?
They could, and they intended to. But here's the complication. It was the time of the Carnea, a sacred Spartan festival, during which military activity was strictly forbidden by law. The same thing had happened at Marathon, when the Spartans arrived too late because of religious obligations. It was also the time of the Olympic Games, which carried its own truce. The Spartan ephors, the magistrates, decided the emergency was great enough to send an advance force under King Leonidas. He took his royal bodyguard of 300 men, gathered allies along the way, and marched north with the understanding that the main Spartan army would follow once the festival ended.
And Leonidas himself? Who was he?
One of Sparta's 2 kings, in his 60s, and by all accounts, a man who knew exactly what he was walking into. Herodotus tells us that he selected his 300 specifically from men who had living sons because he expected them all to die. He'd also consulted the oracle at Delphi, which had delivered a characteristically bleak prophecy. Either Sparta was to be destroyed or a king of Sparta would die. Leonidas appears to have accepted this as his fate and marched anyway.
That's a remarkable thing to carry into battle.
Before the fighting started, Xerxes sent an emissary offering terms. The Greeks could have their freedom, good land, and the honorary title Friends of the Persian People if they handed over their weapons. Leonidas' response has become one of the most famous military retorts in history. Xerxes said, "Hand over your arms." Leonidas replied, "Molon labe, come and take them." When a Persian messenger told the Greeks that Persian arrows would be so numerous that they would blot out the sun, one of the Spartan warriors, a man named Dianakes, replied, "So much the better. We shall fight in the shade."
They had good writers in their ranks.
Whether or not those lines were said exactly that way, they capture the spirit of what happened next. Xerxes waited 4 days, presumably expecting the Greeks to see reason and disperse. They didn't, and on the 5th day he sent his troops in. Walk us through the actual fighting. The first 2 days were catastrophic for the Persians. The narrowness of the pass meant that their numbers were irrelevant. They could only engage the Greeks on a front of about 15 meters. The Greek hoplites, in tight phalanx formation with overlapping shields and long spears, were perfectly suited to this kind of close-order fighting. The Spartans used a tactic of feigned retreat. They'd fall back, the Persians would surge forward, then the Greeks would wheel and cut them down. Xerxes is said to have leapt to his feet 3 times watching his men die. He even sent in his elite unit, the Immortals, 10,000 specially selected warriors, and they were repulsed like everyone else. Persian casualties were enormous. Greek losses were comparatively light.
So after 2 days, why didn't the Greeks just hold? It sounds like they were winning.
Because of one man, a local resident named Ephialtes, and his name has meant nightmare in Greek ever since, approached Xerxes and offered him to show him a mountain path that wound over the hills behind the Greek position. There was a track used by shepherds that bypassed the pass entirely and came out behind the Greek lines. Leonidas knew about it. He'd stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the heights to guard it. But when the Persian Immortals came up the track in the night, the Phocians heard the rustling of oak leaves at dawn and jumped up in alarm. Hydarnes initially feared they were Spartans. Ephialtes had to reassure him they weren't. The Phocians retreated uphill, apparently believing the Persians had come specifically to attack them. Not wishing to be delayed, the Persians simply fired a volley of arrows and went around them, continuing down the far side of the mountain. So the trap had a back door, and now it was being used. Leonidas received the news at dawn. He knew that within hours the Persians would be behind him and the entire Greek force would be encircled. He made a decision. Dismiss the allies, let them march south and survive to fight another day, and stay with the Spartans to hold the pass, or at least delay the Persian advance long enough for the allied army to get clear.
And this is where the story gets complicated, because it wasn't just the Spartans who stayed.
This is perhaps the most overlooked part of the whole story. The 700 Thespians chose to remain. Their city of Thespia lay directly in the path of the Persian advance, and their commander Demophilus understood that if Thermopylae fell without delay, Thespia would be among the first burned. But they also made a choice that was, by any measure, an extraordinary act of courage. They stayed not because they had to, but because it was right. They are almost never mentioned in popular accounts of Thermopylae, and it's a serious historical injustice. What about the Thebans? Weren't there Thebans there too? So, Spartans, Thespians, and a disputed group of Thebans. What happened in the final engagement? They moved to a small hill, later called Kolonos Hill, just inside the pass. Here, the Greeks made their last stand, knowing they were surrounded. They fought until their spears broke, then with swords, then, according to Herodotus, with bare hands and teeth. The Persians eventually overwhelmed them through sheer weight of numbers, advancing across their own dead. Every Spartan and every Thespian was killed. Leonidas himself died in the fighting, and the Persians reportedly fought over his body afterwards. Xerxes was so furious at the resistance that he had Leonidas's head cut off and placed on a stake. That tells you how badly the battle had rattled him. It does. Persian casualties over the 3 days were enormous. Herodotus says around 20,000, which modern historians consider a plausible order of magnitude, though exact numbers are impossible to verify. The Greeks lost perhaps 4,000 in total, including the final 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians. After the battle, the Simonides poem was inscribed on the Spartan memorial. Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Let's do the counterfactual. What if Ephialtes hadn't betrayed them? It's one of the more fascinating what-ifs in ancient history. The Greeks had supplies and the pass was holding. There's a reasonable argument that without the mountain path being revealed, they could have held for several more weeks, possibly long enough to seriously disrupt Persian supply lines and winter plans. Crucially, the Athenian fleet was engaging the Persian navy at Artemisium simultaneously. If Thermopylae had held, the battle at sea might also have reached a decisive result. The evacuation of Athens, which did happen, and which led to the Greek naval victory at Salamis, might not have been necessary at all. We might remember Thermopylae not as a last stand, but the pass that broke the Persian invasion. So instead it fell, Athens was evacuated and burnt, and yet Greece still won? Because of Salamis, yes. The Persian fleet was destroyed there in late 480 BC, and Xerxes, fearing he'd be trapped in Europe, withdrew with most of his army. The following year, the remaining Persian forces were decisively defeated at the Battle of Plataea. The invasion was over, the Greek world survived, and the delay brought at Thermopylae, particularly the time it gave Athens to evacuate, is widely considered to have been essential to making all of that possible. Why did it matter? What did Thermopylae actually mean then and now? At the time, it was immediately transformed into a symbol. The fact that free men, fighting for their own land and their own laws, had held an overwhelming imperial army for 3 days, that mattered enormously to Greek morale. Herodotus wrote his histories partly to answer the question of how Greece survived, and Thermopylae is central to his answer. The Greeks fought better because they were fighting for something. The Persians fought because they were compelled. Over the next 2,500 years, that idea has been invoked by almost every culture that has ever faced a larger enemy and chosen to resist. The phrase Molon labe is still used. The epitaph of Simonides is still quoted. And Leonidas's decision to stay when he could have left, to die in order to buy time for others, remains one of the defining examples of what leadership can look like in extremis. And the 300 film? A spectacular piece of cinema that is historically almost entirely fiction, from the size of the Greek force to the portrayal of Xerxes to the political machinations in Sparta to the grotesque depiction of the Persians. What it gets right is the feeling, the narrowness of the pass, the outnumbered defiance, the final stand on the hill. The emotional truth, at least, is real. The rest is Gerard Butler.
That'll do it for today. I'm Hugo.
And I'm Paul. Molon labe.